Hi, I'm Sam London, and today I want to talk to you about my newest game, Common Sense. What I'm hoping will be the first game in what I'm calling the Will to Fight system. Common Sense is an asymmetrical, trick taking, card driven war game with point to point movement about the American Revolution, celebrating the 250th anniversary of the birth of the United States, and I am extremely excited to talk to you about it today. I already did another video, a briefer video that was a pitch for the game, give people a rough idea of it. But here I want to do a much deeper dive into the systems. I'm actually going to teach the whole game, and so it should give a much better idea of what the game is and how it plays. Hopefully, convince you to consider pre-ordering. So, again, covering ground again from that video, just in case you didn't see that and are coming straight here. The Will to Fight system, Common Sense itself, revolves around this Will to Fight track. And so the idea here is, as one player is the British, the other is the colonies. They're fighting. They're going to be doing things that cause their opponents to lose will to fight on this track. And so they'll move further down this track, and eventually the two counters will cross over. And once they do, that'll trigger the end of the game. You'll finish the current game turn, which is a game turn is an entire hand of cards, 10 card hand, so 10 tricks. And so you would finish out the turn with your hand, and then you would count up points. Points is going to be 1 point per square fortified space that you control, and then +1 for each of these keys that you pull your opponent's will to fight across before the end of the game. A lot of the asymmetry of the game comes into how you cause your opponent to lose will to fight, and we'll cover that as we get a little bit further into the game system. As mentioned, this is a trick-taking game, and so a turn consists of 10 tricks. For each trick, there's going to be a lead player. The lead player will select a card from their hand and play face up for the other player to see. So the British player, for example, could play Lord North here. He is a blue 3. The blue suit is the recruit suit. And so it is a must-follow trick taker. So now the colonial player would have to play a blue card from their hand if able. If the card they play is a 3 or higher, then they would win the trick and they get to resolve that impulse. But if they are unable to play a card of that suit, or they do play a card of that suit but it's a 2 or lower, they would lose the trick, and then the British get to resolve it. The exception to that is because you can play any card you want if you don't have that suit. In this case, the colonial player doesn't have a blue, say. If they are able to play any yellow card, that would trump the blue suit. It's always the same trump for the entire suit, so every blue card is trumped by the yellow special suit. Then they would win with the trump. Regardless of why you win, whoever wins that trick then gets to resolve the card. And so the card gives you the actions that you can take, along with some text, the event text in the card that, gives you that historical flavor and special options there. So, coming back to the cards themselves, the cards are split evenly into 4 suits. The 4 suits are Recruit, Battle, Mobilize, and then this yellow special suit. As I have said a few times, this is a pretty asymmetrical game, and so even though both players' decks have all of these suits in them, the way Recruit resolves, Battle resolves, and Mobilize resolves is subtly different to quite different depending on which faction you are playing. And the yellow suit is radically different for both players. Both players' decks are 36 cards. All 36 cards are unique, and each of them is going to be flavored after a specific person, event, or key concept from the American Revolution. And so, having covered that overview, I think we're going to start getting into what the actions actually do. So, as I said, each year is going to be a hand. So at the start of a year, you're going to have a 10-card hand, and then you're going to get a 5-card free mulligan. That's every year, so you get to do a little bit of strategizing around what cards are in your hand to try to maybe I want to recruit a lot this year, so you might pitch a couple of green cards because you're not thinking you're going to be doing any large campaigns that require a lot of movement. And so you would discard, say, pitch 3 green cards from your hand that you don't want, and then you will draw 3 cards to replace them from your deck, hopefully drawing more blue recruit cards, and then you'll shuffle those set-aside cards you didn't want back into your draw deck. As noted, the deck is 36 cards, which means that you will go through your entire deck over the course of 3 years, which we actually call a campaign. So you will play 3 complete hands before you'll reshuffle and you'll start to see your cards again. So let's come back up and we're going to start talking about... Actually, yeah, before we talk about actions, I also want to talk a little bit more about how the cards work. So every card has a suit. So let's look at Benedict Arnold. Every card has a suit. So Benedict Arnold is part of the battle suit. They have a trump suit, so all battle cards are trumped by mobilize cards. They have a value. This is only relevant for the trick taking, but Benedict Arnold is a 5. And then down here, this is where we get into the meat of what the card is and how it works. So this is a 2 battle action card. So you would, if you win a trick with Benedict Arnold, you'll get to resolve 2 battle actions. And then down here is the event. The events are fit into, actually, an example of another kind here. The events can fit into 3 flavors. The first one, right here, with Patriot Newspapers, you can see with that little lightning bolt here. By the way, none of these, I should have noted, none of these components are final. This is all placeholder playtest artwork. The lightning bolt means that the event is instant. So as soon as you win the trick, you resolve the event itself, and then you get to perform your actions. The second kind is this, noted by this little plus here, which means that the event text modifies how the actions on the card itself work. And then the final kind, which you could argue is generally the most powerful, is this hourglass, which means this is a held remain in play card, which will give you a special rule that'll modify the entire rest of the campaign, being those 3 hands of cards. And so if you're able to get these out earlier, you'll get a lot of additional benefit. They're harder to play because you know less about what's left in your opponent's deck, but they can have a huge impact on those next few turns. Now, the next thing I wanted to point out, which is actually I now have here in a perfect lineup, is that higher value cards, so this blue 8, are much easier to win a trick with because the value of the card is higher. But they also give you fewer actions. So Patriot Newspapers only gives you 1 recruit action. I'll talk about what that gavel means later. Benedict Arnold is a 5, which is kind of a middle value card. Gives you 2 battle actions. And then Lord North here, which is a 3 lower value card, gives you 3 recruit actions. So the higher value cards give you fewer actions because they're easier to win tricks with. The lower value cards give you much more actions, but it also applies to the events. Events on higher value cards are usually either weaker or very situational, whereas events on lower value cards, for example, George Washington being a 0, are game-changing, extremely powerful events that can end up turning the tide of who's actually going to win the game. Okay, so having covered all of that, now let's cover what the actions are. So I like to cover these in increasing order of asymmetry. So the simplest is mobilize. So when this says you have 3 actions, what that means is you can pick 3 armies. An army is a stack. A stack is up to 5 circular unit counters here. You can move them. That would be 1 action. You can move the same army multiple times, so that would actually be all 3 actions to do that. Or I can move them and then move a separate army for another action, and so on. Pretty simple. The only asymmetry for mobilize is that the colonials can just move. They don't have anything to worry about. They're the simplest in that regard. The British, though, have to keep their forces in supply. And so if we look, say, let's look at the garrison up here in Boston. You can see we have 3 British regulars up here. Each of them is marked with the little supply wagon symbol on them, which means every time I move them, I have to pay supply for each counter that I'm moving. So even just moving them from Boston to Portsmouth, if I come down here, I would have to spend 1 supply for each of those counters in order to move them. Now, that's a good time to come back up here and note. So there are these special icons on both decks. The special icon for the British deck is the supply icon. The special icon for the colonial deck is the Continental Congress icon. Now, the reason that these are special is because when you win a trick, you might decide that, okay, I won this. Let's say I won a trick with, let's say I won a trick with Patriot Newspapers, and I don't actually want to do the event. I don't want to. I don't care about recruiting. It's not my priority right now. What I really need to do is move my army. If I want to do that, I always have the option to blank the card, meaning treat the card as though there's nothing on it to do any one action of all of the potential actions I can do. Excuse me. Of all the actions that I can do, the special thing about those hexagon icons is when you blank a card, you always get the hexagon. Always. So even if this would be a horrible thing to do, but let's say I won a trick with Lord North, but I don't want to recruit and I don't care about his effect, which is crazy because it's a very high value card. But let's just say I want to blank it so I could do a single battle somewhere. I still would get all 3 supply from this card because it's in that hex. But anyway, that's how supply works. So that's it for the mobilized suit. The next most asymmetrical one is battle. So when you battle, you are going to pick a single space that contains enemy pieces. So here we could do Springfield, Massachusetts, has both colonial militia along with British regulars, and we would resolve a round of combat there. I'm going to come back to how combat actually works in a little bit, but suffice to say, you would resolve a round of combat. You then have the option as the active player to either pick another space to resolve a battle in, or you could actually resolve another round of battle in that same space before the results of the battle are evaluated. So you could say, I'm not really happy with how that first round of battle went. I'm going to push my luck here and resolve another round to try to turn the tide before I say, now we're going to, see what the ramifications were of that battle. Once again, there's some asymmetries here, though, and they're going to start to increase. For the British, again, for the supply, they have to spend a supply for each unit that is going to roll dice in the battle, provided they have that supply marker on them. That's their asymmetry. For the colonials here, if they are the active player, they're going to have the option to resolve attrition combat. Attrition combat means that, for all intents and purposes, they have no chance of seizing control of the space that they're fighting over, but by announcing that, they also it becomes impossible for them to take return fire from the British. So it's them kind of taking pot shots and then retreating at the expense of not being able to actually try to take land back or hold it. Well, that'll make a little bit more sense when I get back and how battles resolve, but that's battles in a nutshell. Okay, recruiting is where things really get variable here. So let's start with the colonies first. The way the colonies recruit is entirely based on the will to fight track. And so we have some missing graphics here, but you can see at the top of the will to fight track, there's this 3, and then as they move further down, there's this 2, and it decreases. Ignore that 0. We're missing graphics. That's actually for the British. This is the number of militia that the colonials get every space in which they recruit. And so let's say, makes more sense with this. The colonies won a trick with Patriot Newspapers. They would pick a single space that they control, which at the beginning of the game is virtually everything, and they would drop 3 colonial militia. Let's say they just want to drop them in West Point. There, that's it. That's how they recruit. That is how all recruiting works for the colonies. It's much simpler for them. For the British, they have a much bigger choice. So for the British, the simplest thing is they do have an equivalent of dropping militia, although it's weaker, which is starting on their end of the track here and moving down. They can recruit Tories. Tories are not particularly strong, but the great thing about Tories is you don't have to supply them, and you can drop them straight into the colonies, provided that you control that space. On the flip side of that, once per card, the British are able to recruit a single British regular in Britain. These are the best piece in the game. You want to have as many British regulars as possible, but the problem is you need to maintain their presence in Britain to continue their conflict with the French and the Spanish. You have to be a little careful about overcommitting them to the colonies. The other problem, though, is that when you recruit them, they start out in Britain. You would need to eventually ship them over to the colonies for them to fight, which we'll cover shortly. So it's 2 options so far. You can recruit Tories as the British. You can recruit once per card a British regular in Britain. The other thing that you can do is recruit Hessians. By bringing in Hessians, you can actually ship a stack of Hessians, so it's 3 Hessians per action, into any port under British control. And so Hessians are fantastic because they're very strong. They're not as strong as the British, but they're close. And you don't have to ship them over. They handle being shipped over themselves. On the flip side of that, though, you do have to pay them, which is a bit of a problem. So there's Tories, British regulars, Hessians. And then you have 2 other special options. For 2 recruit actions, you can place a British Navy in Britain. And alternatively, for 2 recruit actions, you can place a British artillery piece, which is not even any on the board yet. But this guy here, you can bring a British artillery piece into Britain. Okay, those are all the options for recruiting for Britain. Britain obviously has way more variety of pieces, and they also have a lot more complexity there on the recruit side of things. Alright, which brings us to the final suit. So special. For the special suit, things are going to be completely different. So I'm going to teach them separately. Let me just find a quick yellow card here. One's a little more exciting. By Rochambeau. So, when you resolve a special card, so let's look here at Rochambeau, you have the choice to resolve either of the 2 special actions specific to that faction. You can either resolve the same action twice, or you can resolve one of each. Here in the case of Joseph Brant, this is a multiply 3. So the British could do 3 naval actions, 3 native actions, 2 and 1, 1 and 2, however they want to break it up. So starting with the colonies, what the special actions are. Training. If you pick a location that only contains militia, you can take a single militia counter and flip it to Continental Army. That's very important for a variety of reasons. I guess I'll just cover them now. Both the Tories as well as the Hessians and the militia are unable to move by themselves. They need to have a unit that doesn't have this disorganized symbol on it in order to move. And so you can plop militia all over the place if you want, but they can't actually move to try to intercept anybody or anything until there's at least one Continental Army with them. And so one training action lets you do that. But if the space already contained at least one Continental Army, you can instead flip all militia in that space Continental Army for a single training action. So the other thing you could do as an example is, say, if I had 2 training actions, I could go 1 to flip the first one, and the second one to flip the remainder. And now that's an army that can actually move around and do a lot more. So that is the way that training works. The next action is the negotiations with the French, which eventually becomes the French action. So at the beginning of the game, you can't actually interact with the French. You can't interact with French pieces at all. There are some things that you can do to get the French and a couple of French benefits early, but generally speaking, what you're going to be doing is resolving French actions to just move up this French alliance track. And so as you move up this track, it's not actually doing anything until you get to the end of this track. Now, the two ways that you're going to move up this track is, one, by resolving that action. The other way you can move up the track is every time you seize initiative from the British, which just means if the British led a trick and then you win the trick as the colonies, that'll also let you move up that track. Once you get all the way to the top of the French track, the French actually enter the war. And so from that point on, this action lets you manipulate French pieces. This is extremely powerful because for a French action, you can bring in a French navy to one of the port spaces. Once the French navy is there, you can do regular naval things with them, like, for example, engage in naval combat or bombard a port. But you can also, for another French action, bring in a French regular. The French regulars are extremely strong. They are pretty much as strong as the British, but in a way they're a little bit stronger because, let's say we were in this situation here. Once the French are in the game, you can use a mobilize action to move the French as though they were a colonial piece. You can use a battle action to battle with the French alongside your colonial pieces. That's fairly obvious. But if you are resolving a French action, you can also, say, move a French piece into here and then battle with the entire army with the French leading the battle. So their assistance and leadership gives the colonial player a lot greater flexibility once they're actually in the war. So that's it for the the colonial special actions. Let's talk about the British special actions. So the British special actions are naval actions and native actions. So the biggest strength that the British have in the game is their navies. So they can move their navies all around the board very quickly. Just a single naval action will let you move a navy from any port to any other port, and they can take a stack that's with them to the new port for just one action. That was actually a very important thing I forgot to mention. When you are spending supply to mobilize or battle with British pieces that require supply, you need to be able to trace a line of spaces that the British control to a port space that contains a British navy. Important rule I need to mention there. So you can move your navies around that way. The other thing you could do, say, is you could move a navy like here to Newport, and then you can do a naval bombardment. This kind of works into how sieging works, which I think I think I'm going to wait to cover that until I cover combat. But you could do a naval bombardment with them. Those are the big two things you would do, is naval movement or naval bombardment. Once the French are in the game, you can actually have ship-to-ship combat, which works very similarly to regular combat. So not really a lot to cover there. Now the natives are where things get a lot different. So for each native action, you can bring in a stack of 3 natives into any marked village space. So like we can bring them in here into Charlotte. So for a native action, I can bring in a stack of natives. I can also move natives, or I can raid. So raiding is going to work differently depending on whether there are colonial pieces in the space or if the space is unoccupied. If there are colonial pieces in the space, raiding effectively allows the natives to attack the colonial pieces without the colonial pieces being able to battle back. But if the space is vacant, then instead the natives will raid the space itself. You can only raid a individual space once per campaign. So again, that's 3 hands of cards. So you would mark it with this counter just to remind yourself it can't be raided against for this campaign. And effectively what you're doing here is you're just doing battle with the space, but instead of causing casualties, you can cause a will to fight loss from the colonies. So it can be dangerous to ignore the natives inland for too long, as they can wreak havoc and cause a lot of will to fight loss for you. The issue with the natives is that they can't battle, so they can raid, which means they can attack colonial pieces without worrying about casualties. But if they are attacked, they also can't fight back under normal circumstances. There's exceptions to all these things because of the cards, but that is the regular limitation for them. So that is it for all of the actions. So let's say we play our 10 cards, we make it to the end of the year. At the end of the year, we have to do some bookkeeping, which is going to bring in a lot of other systems I need to talk about. So first off, everything above this winter line at the end of the year, so Virginia or further north, is going to be subject to winter attrition. What that's going to do is, if you have an army in a space that is not fortified, so any circular space, and that piece can't raid, so that pretty much means that no... the natives are unaffected. But let's just say you had militia, like let's say up here in Springfield. This is a non-fortified space at the end of the year. You are going to lose half of your pieces there, rounded up to winter attrition. That applies to both the colonies and to the British. If you are in a fortified space, square space, you are not affected by winter attrition unless you are currently sieging that location. So let's say that these militia were trying to take Boston. Bring these back. Because Boston is under British control, we can see that the British are actually the ones controlling that space, which means that the colonies do not benefit from the fortification, so they would still be subject to winter attrition there. So after we've done winter attrition, we are going to look at British perception. So I did not mention this, but every time that the British win a trick over the course of the year, they are going to gain British perception. So 10 card hand, maximum they're going to get is 10 on British perception. At the end of the year, they're going to add whatever their final value is here to the number of red pieces, so navies or British regulars, that they have present in Britain. And for each point that they are short of 10 from that total. So let's just look at this example here. We have 2 British regulars and 1 British Navy in Britain, and they won 4 tricks. So we add those together to 7, so that because they fell short 3 from 10, they're going to lose 3 will to fight at the end of the year for that shortfall, and then this will reset for the new year. So if you're winning a whole bunch of tricks for that year, you don't have to worry so much about your presence in Britain. But if you're getting shellacked on the trick-taking portion of it, you might even consider pulling some home to try to mitigate that will to fight loss for the year. So that is that for British perception. On the flip side of that, we never actually came back to this, so we'll cover it now. At the end of the year, the colonies need to have a certain level on the Continental Congress track. And you can see that how high they're supposed to be increases as the game goes on. So in 75, you only need to be at a 1 for the end of the year. 79, you need to be all the way up to a 5. Now, for each point you fall south of that, just like with British perception, you'll lose that much on the will to fight track. The difference is, what's key about this, I didn't mention this, but on average, every card in the colonial deck is 1 value lower than every card in the British deck. So it's a little bit harder on average to win tricks as the colonies versus the British. However, as you gain Continental Congress levels, every time the colonies play a card, they have the option to spend however much levels they want off of the Continental Congress track to increase their value of their card by the amount that they spend. So, for example, if I really want to play George Washington, it's hard to win a trick with a 0 without a lot of planning. But let's say I'm all the way up to a 6 on the Congress track. I could spend 1, 2, 3 off the Continental Congress track to turn him into a 3 as he is played. So that'll make it a lot easier to win with. So anyway, after you've done that, the last thing you check is for Hessians. So for each space that the British have at least as many Hessians as they have British regulars at that point, they'll lose a will to fight for each of those spaces. Or they can dismiss the Hessians. If they want, they can just immediately dismiss the Hessians to avoid that. On the coastline, that's like not a big deal. But if you end up using them to help you garrison more inland fortifications, that can be problematic to dismiss them right before the start of a new year, and the colonies can just easily come take them back. So that's it for that overview. Now is definitely the time to talk about combat. So to talk about combat, we need to look at the counters more closely. So combat in the game revolves around these 3 colors of dice. So there are red, white, and blue dice, with white being the weakest die, blue being a middling die, and red being the strongest die. When you look at the counters here, you can see the dice are shown on them. So here we have a single white die on each of our militia, and a single red die on each of these British regulars. What that means is we are going to be, for this a single round of battle here, we're going to be rolling 3 white dice to 2 red dice. The pips shown on the dice here remind us of what the to-hit value is for those dice. So white dice only hit on a 5 or better. Red dice, on the other hand, hit on a 3 or better. And blue dice are in the middle, hitting on a 4 or better. So what you would do is you would roll, in this case, those 3 white dice against the 2 red dice and count up the hits. 6s, regardless of the color of the die, count as 2 hits. And so we would say, let's run it real quick, see what happens here. So we got our 3 white dice to our 2 red dice. So we're going to roll. The white dice had 1 hit. Come on, let's give us something better than that. Okay, and then we have 2 hits on our red dice. So now that we have that, we have to roll for saves. So what that means is there are 2 hits that are coming towards the colonial player and 1 hit going toward the British player. The next thing that's shown here on the counter is that the militia only save on a 5 or better, whereas the British regulars are much more durable. They're only going to be taken out on or they will be saved if they roll a 3 or higher, meaning they'd only be taken out on a 1 or a 2. So, because there's 1 hit going towards the British, they're going to roll 1 die. And they rolled a 2, which is actually a loss, so one of these regulars would be eliminated. And then the colonial player needs to roll 2 dice, because they had 2 hits coming their way. And those are both going to fail their save, so they're going to lose 2 militia. So, again, if this was if they were resolving a card that gave them 2 or more battle actions, they would have the option to resolve another round of combat. But let's just say that's it. This is however much of it we're going to run. What would happen now is we would look at which side dealt the most casualties. So here, the British dealt 2 casualties, while the colonies only dealt 1. Whichever side dealt more casualties, if they don't already control it, would take control of that space. Then, whichever side did not successfully gain control of space, they took more casualties, we would look to see if they took at least half as many casualties as their starting force at the beginning of the battle, in which case they did. They would then be forced to retreat, and so they would retreat to Albany. Since it's the only place they can go, they can't go to Boston because it's already under British control. So that would be the complete battle at that point. So that's how battle goes in a nutshell. I'm going to cover a few extra cases about it, though, just to give you a better idea on how some of these edge cases work. So let's say these guys had instead moved to start to siege Boston. And so the colonies are the active player and they're sieging Boston. As soon as they say, all right, we're attacking, because Boston controls this space and it's a square space, it's a fortified location, they now have the option to say, we're going to resolve this as a siege. If they choose to resolve it as a siege, they're just going to sacrifice one of their pieces, just one of their pieces is gone, and the battle is canceled. That is the way a siege would work. The British alternatively can say, which they probably would in this situation, I'm pretty sure we can beat you in an actual field battle, in which case they just say, we're going to resolve it as a battle. And so in that case, there is no automatic loss, and it would just be resolved normally. When resolving a siege, though, let's say... Where's that piece? There it is. We left it out. Let's say that the colonies had artillery, as they did historically, for the siege of Boston, and the British garrison Boston says, we're going to resolve this as a siege. They take the loss, but in addition to that, anything with the bombardment icon shown here also gets to resolve a special round of combat here. So you can see the artillery, very powerful. They get 2 red dice. And so they would, in addition to this loss, they get to resolve 2 red dice worth of combat without taking return fire. However, because it is a siege, they still have their regular to hit, but the save for the British automatically becomes 3+. Here it already is 3+, but say it was weaker forces, like say they had Tories with them, they would also be treated as 3+ for resolving the siege. That is the way that it would work if you are doing bombardment with artillery. It's the same way it would work if you're doing a naval siege. So that's how that works. So the last couple of things I want to cover, there's plenty of extra bits of chrome here, especially in the cards I'm not covering right now. But this is at least giving you a much stronger idea of how the game works. As I've come all the way back to the beginning, I said the game revolves around this will to fight track, and the things that make you lose will to fight are asymmetrical. I mentioned how the colonies lose will to fight due to bad governance, and I mentioned how the British lose will to fight by negative perception back home, and Parliament's negative perception on how the war is going. But there are other ways to lose will to fight. Perhaps the most important, if the British ever control an entire colony, so here you can see Fort Ticonderoga, Albany, West Point, New York, Genesee, and Fort Niagara all make up New York. If they manage to successfully take all of New York, the colonies lose a massive 6 will to fight. On the flip side of that, if they take Connecticut, that's only 1 space, but they'll lose 2 will to fight for losing Connecticut. The colonies only get that back if they retake the entire colony. So that's the major British objective, is to try to take entire colonies to just rapidly chip away at the colonial will to fight. Another thing that they're trying to do is force the colonies to winter outside of key points, because every time the colonies take a will to fight loss, winter attrition losses in a space, they lose a will to fight for each space in which they take a winter attrition loss. So those are the biggest things they have to look out for. For the British, I actually mentioned their big ones being the perception, the Hessians, but the biggest thing that they have to worry about is loss of British regulars. As I mentioned, the British regulars are the strongest piece in the game, but every single British regular that is lost is a will to fight loss for the British. So they have to be pretty careful on how they actually deploy them. Okay, that's virtually everything I really want to cover for this video. There's things I didn't cover. There's an automatic loss condition for the colonies if the British successfully capture the Congress. Benedict Arnold is a very special card or concept in the game because he is extremely powerful in the colonial deck, but he's also in the British deck, and as soon as the British version of Benedict Arnold is resolved, you flip this, and the colonial version doesn't work anymore. There's little things like that, but this should definitely give you a very strong idea of how the game works and if it's for you. So, again, if you're interested in a asymmetrical card-driven game with trick-taking elements, you are interested in the American Revolution, and you really want to dive into a kind of a more sandboxy design that really celebrates the history and lets you kind of have fun with it, I really hope you'll consider pre-ordering the game. And thanks so much.